In the last few videos, we've been using the chat agent to build workflows, generate code, and research references. In this one, we're going under the hood, how the agent actually does those things and where it struggles. The agent isn't a silver bullet. For simple workflows, edits, and variations, it's fast and reliable. For complex workflows with lots of moving parts or tricky data, you'll get much better results if you understand how it works. We'll look at how the agent sees your canvas, what it can and can't do when it creates nodes, and walk through 3 examples. A simple example, an edit-based, and then something complex so that you know when to reach for the agent, when to build by hand, and how to kind of scale up when the agent can't do everything you want in one go. So let's talk about how the agent sees your canvas. If we go back to a previous chat, we'll go back to our previous chat that just made like a simple Gary building edit. Let's look at what happens when the agent's working. So we've asked it to edit a Gary building to display it during the day and the night. And the first thing it does is it reads nodes. So this is a skill that the agent has. You can see that it reads the schema of what's on the canvas. In this case, it would be our Gary building. And so it finds that node on the canvas. It's a single node. There's nothing else on the canvas. So it takes the context of what's happening on the canvas using a skill that we've made. And then the next thing it does is it starts looking for model parameters. So it decides it needs an edit model, and then it gets the schema returned of how that model works, its pricing, information about it to then determine if that's the model that it wants to use. So you can imagine that right now when the agent is looking at this canvas, it reads these nodes, it gets a single node, and then it gets model parameters. And so it has a very small amount of information. And we know that models generally work really well when they have a short amount of very specific information. You can imagine that if we added a lot of pollution to the canvas, that when we go and ask it to do this, now it would go and read all the nodes, and instead of getting a single node, it would get many nodes. It would then need to check each one of them, and it gets all this information about it. You could start to see how the agent would then struggle potentially to figure out like which node should it be working on, and the amount of information available to it becomes a bit overwhelming, so it's unable to make accurate calls based on the information that you have on the canvas. So the rule of thumb for when starting something with an agent is have either a completely new chat for your work, or start with only the specific nodes you need on the canvas or workflow that's highly relevant to what you're trying to do. Next up is thinking about what happens when the agent creates a node. So in order to connect this image to a nano banana node that it said it wants to make, it has to do a few different things. It has to set the model of the node that it creates. It has to set its parameters, labels, how its input works. In the case of the code node, it has to write code directly into that node and diff it against the existing code. And then it needs to connect them. So let's play through that. In this next step, it creates 2 nano banana nodes. It defines all the parameters of those nodes. It then goes and connects those 2 nodes. So again, it's just adding more and more information to its context, and then connects the image to the input. And then again, down here, it does the same. And it also sets the prompt on these. So you can see here that when it's creating the node, it's setting a prompt. The next thing it does is it goes through the canvas, checks the IDs of the inputs and outputs of the target nodes, and then it starts to go through and try and connect those. Now, at a basic level, connection is pretty straightforward in terms of just connecting this output to this input. However, when we have more complicated data structures, like potentially multiple images, the agent needs to make a determination of how to handle that when it's being plugged into this node. So it would look at this node and think, wow, there's 2 images here. I need to decide whether or not I want to merge them into a single item that's going to be run once, or am I going to need to run this prompt on each one of these images? Sometimes it's smart about this, but sometimes it can also get this totally wrong. And the downstream effect of that is that you could have potentially many images or many list items plugged into the input of a node. And when it runs, if it runs on each one of those, you could imagine that it's going to burn many credits. So it's something you really need to be mindful of when you're reviewing the output of the agent. Although for simple cases, it generally can get this right. But where it's weaker is when it has to reason about complex lists or data structures and when you're passing around big amounts of data. So the takeaway here is to be really mindful about how the agent structures input when it's connecting to them. Another final gotcha is when you ask it to specify something as a parameter and then it also references that inside of the prompt. It can get tripped up on this. In this case, it's trying to describe the scene at the attached time of day. And it looks like golden hour is the correct input here. It's plugged in, but it's also referencing this by its output. When it runs this, it is saying that you didn't actually specify a particular time of day, and then it gives you a few different descriptions of different times of the day. So something's not quite working here. And the fact that this input is not really doing anything and it's getting confused. The data structure of this is not rational. And so we should either have like one input that's driven here with this, driven by this parameter, or to ensure that it's taking an input and using it properly. But these sorts of cases where it adds a parameter can definitely confuse the agent. Be mindful of that case. So now we'll go through a few more examples. Let's try building something from scratch. So we'll close our chat, delete those nodes. The canvas is now blank if it tries to read it. So in this first one, we will just build a workflow that takes a photo, generates a few different variations with Nano Banana. And so already we observe something that I think is a little bit confusing. And that's that it's taking an image and then it's also generating a set of style prompts and passing them into the prompt. So it's created a parametric workflow for this where it's generating each one of these inputs on the fly, and then it's plugging those into the Nano Banana node. The alternative way to do this is you could have asked, can I have them as 3 specific nodes where I can set the inputs myself? I think it's a lack of specificity that gets a kind of a strange output here. We could just tell the agent to do that. So in this example, we just have more manual control. We'll end up with 3 separate images that we can then work from and edit, and it just uses a different data structure. Okay, so let's imagine that I have made my own adjustments to this, and now I want to do something like combine these 2 images, do like an incremental step on this through using the agent. I've changed it since the previous chat that I was using, and I don't think this chat is relevant to the current setup of this canvas. So the first thing I'm going to do is actually close this chat so I can start a new one. So what we're asking is to take the 2 edits and then blend the 2 styles together. Let's see what the agent does. So it gets the canvas. It then gets model parameters to figure out what it wants to create. It creates 2 nodes. In this case, it creates the text node here as the input, and then also the edit node. It then connects these nodes and organizes them. And so you can see where it's gone wrong in this case. Like, it's plugged in the original image. I actually just wanted to blend the 2 style outputs here. So this is something that's easy to correct manually when you kind of work iteratively, step by step. So finally, we'll try and do something really advanced. So I'm going to delete the canvas, start a new chat, and give it a complex prompt. So we're going to build a kitchen redesign tool that takes a photo, finds 3 reference images from the web, blends each with the source, it upscales them, and then displays them in a comparison gallery. It may have even been worth considering using Opus or a better agent for this. Okay, so it's wired up a few things. Let's talk about them. So one, it's asking us to input an image. So I'll add a kitchen. The first thing it does is it uses Gemini Flash to analyze the kitchen. So we'll run this node. So it comes up with 3 different concepts based off of this kitchen input. So then it's taking this and adding this as a query to a search node. So this should use Brave to search the web. We've run this. It's searched for a few different concepts. And then you'll notice that it's working with a more complex data structure. And so it's actually going to use JavaScript to work with the data that's been returned. So the output data that it's working with, if we use the text node to inspect this, is like a JavaScript list. And we don't really need to worry about this too much because the agent is going to extract it and modify this data in a certain way so that it can be passed nicely to this final prompt. If I run this, it should then fetch these images and output them in a certain way. And so this step isn't quite working. So we're going to ask it to... So we've asked it to verify that it's handling this output correctly, and it's made some improvements to the code. So let's try running it. Okay, and we can see that there's this logical error with the way that it's handling the data. It is taking the image, the original image, but then it's also just creating images from descriptions of the remaining images based off these searches. I don't think that this is exactly what we wanted, and you can see that it is working on each input here, so it's never going to consider this image and any other images. So I think what we've kind of exposed here is that like this is a pretty bad way to approach a complex workflow. What we really want to do is we want to break this down into individual steps so that we can have some control over it. And I think just generally the agent biases towards trying to make reusable workflows. And in a lot of cases, you probably just want to experiment and not necessarily concerned about the reusability of a workflow. You just want to kind of iterate on ideas. In this case of, for example, like seeing variations on this kitchen. Let's now see what this would look like if we approached it more incrementally. So I'm going to delete all those additional nodes, and then I'm going to close the chat and start again. So we're going to start by saying to use the kitchen image on the canvas, add a reference image input and a create node with Nano Banana Pro that will restyle this kitchen using the reference. Great. So it's gone and done that. It's given us the reference input here, and it's given us a good prompt, and it's using the model we specified. We're then going to ask it to replace that reference image with a search. Okay. And what's cool about this is that, so now it's going to perform a search for kitchens. It's going to input that into some JavaScript, and then it's going to produce pairs where it will work on the image and then the paired style reference that will be generated from this search. So it's running now with errors. So we'll ask it to fix the code node. Okay, so now we run it and it has an output, but the output is of an empty list. In this case, this is more of a complicated data processing scenario. So I'm going to upgrade to a more advanced agent such as Opus. Great. So it's now producing 3 separate pairs. If we run this, you can see the pairs that it is producing. So it'll be this one and this one, this one and this one, this one and this one. Obviously, this is not the greatest reference, so we could probably do more work with search. But now we kind of got exactly what we were hoping for, which is that it'll take this reference, apply it to different styles. And now when we run this Nano Banana, I'll use Nano Banana 2 since it's a bit cheaper. When we run this, it'll run on each of these pairs of images. And so that should output 3 images. Okay, so we're done with this chat. We can close it, and you can see that it has copied over those styles that it found to the 3 kitchens. And so with a little bit more work, we could make this, with the agent, we could make this a reusable workflow. The difference between the previous complicated prompt and then the incremental step-by-step is just like how much you've asked from the agent in one turn. So for simple workflows, you can one-shot them. For complex ones, it's way better if you layer it and then verify each step as you go and let the agent write good code when it needs to handle data in more complex ways.